What is up, YouTube? We are back with the Troponin Episodes, episode 26. Friendly reminder, if you're enjoying these, you can find a lot more of our content on teamtroponin.com. You can like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop us any comments on things you'd like us to touch on, as well as let us know if you are Team Nut Butter, Team Guac, the age-old question. And before we jump in tonight, we just want to give a shout-out to one of our subscribers, and Dave and I are friends with him. He's now a client of Justin, Jimmy Leone. You've been so supportive, and we're just appreciative of you. We just made a post on the Team Troponin Instagram page, and Jimmy, without being asked, just kind of left us a testimonial, and he's been a subscriber from day one, and he's kept in touch with all of us, and he's doing really well on his rebound. So we're excited to see where he goes next year.
Yep, thank you, Jimmy.
Yeah, and if you guys are watching this recent, we just did a big content drop on teamtroponin.com. A whole new section started. We're following an actual contest prep of someone who actually did turn pro as a super heavyweight and went on to have a successful competition professional career. And I think 8 or 9 other articles were dropped just in the last couple of days. So it's a big content drop right now. A good time to sign up.
If you guys have things you want us to touch on relating to nutrition, training, or the PT rehab, again, leave us a comment. It gives us an idea of what you want to hear about, and we can kind of tailor our content towards that for you. So we've gotten a lot of questions about THC, which is kind of as Dave said, perennial topic in bodybuilding. So we're going to jump off tonight's conversation with that.
Yeah. Justin, what are your thoughts on bodybuilding?
People always ask that, because you think, it gives you the munchies, right? Obviously, that can't work with bodybuilding, But THC is very weird because picture your quintessential pothead, like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo. It's always some gangly, thin dude, But pothead, that's always, and whenever they do studies on it, that's what they expect the opposite. They expect weight gain. They expect frequent snacking, and it's prescribed for cancer patients because it does help appetite. But the weird thing that happens whenever they find studies is that people who, like chronic THC users, tend to have better body composition than non-THC users, and no one really fully understands why. There seems to be some positive effect on metabolism, or because it can't be energy expenditure because it's not like you're exerting a lot of energy on it. But it's a really kind of an interesting thing. It's a fun rabbit hole to go down. I haven't gone down in a while, but yeah, it's like because you could imagine these researchers putting this study together. It's like, okay, we're gonna study this, learn why it makes you eat so much, so we can apply that to help these burn victims or these cancer patients gain weight. And then they study these potheads, and they're all thin. And in a lot of cases, we're pretty tightly constrained with our total metabolism. I mean, there's some outliers, but it's really confusing because I think they overestimate the calories they consume. They do consume a fairly high amount of calories, but they don't gain weight, and they tend to have, it's not like with body composition, it's not just that they're gangly, they tend to have lower body fat. It's really interesting. So my general thought is I don't think there's any benefit on body composition. I mean, I just there may be some weird interaction with cannabinoids, because there's a lot of weird interactions. We're learning with CBD oil and stuff like that.
Right, especially with pathways.
Yeah, so there very likely is some pathway somewhere that does actually improve body composition, but I think at the very least, I don't think there's anything negative, provided you can stay on plan with your diet.
That was kind of what I was wondering, is how much of it do you think is behavioral, in a sense that people who maybe are anxious eaters or stress eaters, maybe if they're not dealing with that anxiety quite as much, there's less of the need to go.
Very likely, yeah. And really, the other weird thing is it's stored in fat, and so you can actually. I've had clients, and I call them a rebuzz. Mm-hmm. I've actually had clients get a little stoned during cardio, and when they haven't done anything. And my only thought is that and these are heavy users. I'm assuming there's got to be enough THC in whatever fat cells happen to be oxidized during that cardio session, that it was recirculated through the blood system and actually got them feeling a little good again, which I always think is kind of interesting. Yeah, I've had that probably rarely, but probably 5 or 6 times, in 20 years, a client mention something like, I don't know if I got a runner's high, like it was endorphins, but I swear I was stoned on the step mill this morning, and I didn't smoke.
That makes sense because I remember, like, I don't tend to bother to buy like grass-fed meat, but I do remember one of the big selling points of it is that if you're going to eat any fattier meat, the fat tends to be a lot healthier because whatever weird, like, I don't know, antibiotics, hormones, whatever the farmers are pumping into, like, their enclosed animals tends to be stored in body fat. And I think body fat is just kind of the storage site for a lot of stuff that your body hasn't recycled yet.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so from my end, if you can stay on plan, go ahead and enjoy yourself. I mean, contest prep's terrible enough. If you can get a little buzz while doing it, go ahead.
Do you ever worry about the potential of, I can't remember if it increases or like the number of aromatase enzyme in your body or the aromatase activity?
Oh yeah, good point. Totally forgot about that. Yeah, it does do something. Oh god, yeah, I think because chronic THC users have lower testosterone and higher estrogen. Geez, I totally forgot about that. I don't remember the pathway. I don't remember if it increases rates of aromatization or not. That's really weird. We should do a deeper dive into this because that like goes completely counter to the improved body composition aspect also.
Well, I think that I'm sure a lot of our audience is enhanced or looking at going that direction if they're into competitive bodybuilding. So maybe if that's the case for you, then maybe it's not something to worry about because you're managing your hormones yourself. But if you're natural, maybe something to consider. I don't really know the magnitudes we're talking about here because a lot of people who are natural will like fuss about with all sorts of hormonal manipulations, and I think in a lot of cases, like transient fluctuations in natural hormone levels are like not really that impactful. But this is N equals 1. But I did have a buddy in high school who was a huge stoner, and he had to get gyno surgery.
Oh yeah,
I think it remember related to his pot use.
I remember from like the DARE program, that's what they always showed. They always showed this like drawing of a human with a male with like female breasts is like just to scare you. This is kind of off topic, but on the idea of like how your body regulates hormones compared to taking hormones. I had recent blood work, not mine, of a client whose total test was 1,024. This is a guy early 40s. Which is, I mean, his previous one was pretty high. This guy's blessed with high testosterone, but his previous one was like 6 something, high for a 40-year-old. But this was over 1,000. But what I thought was incredibly interesting, his free test was almost exactly the same in both cases, and his SHBG shot sky high, which I thought was really interesting. So it was like the body was, like it seems like when the body's doing the testosterone itself, it's much more adept at keeping free testosterone in a range that it thinks it should be at compared to when you supply the testosterone yourself.
That is exactly what I have found. Because there was a time when I was cruising on like 200 mgs for like a year and a half. And granted, 200 mgs is like a little above a true replacement dose, but my total T was just at the top of the reference range, maybe a little over, maybe like 1,100. But my SHB was really low. And my free T was like, I don't know, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was like 3 times the top of the reference range.
Yeah, same experience. My free T is always high when I'm on TRT, and I never really had seen anything like this where someone's had jumped up so much. I really have no idea why it would. It can't be like a permanent thing. Maybe there's some aberration. I mean, I don't think we really, or I don't really understand. I understand how testosterone is synthesized, cholesterol converts to androstenedione and the whole, DHEA process. But I don't understand like why the body decides to do what it does or what amplifies that. But something really did in this guy's body, at least on that day. And it was really intriguing to me to see that the body also realized that, hey, this is abnormal. Let me find a way to bring it back to normal. I mean, total side topic, but I thought that was very interesting.
Well, that's for the THC. I assumed that it wouldn't really affect an enhanced person all that much, but now I'm kind of curious. So if anyone here, like ever, if you use a lot and if you're on, exogenous test, I'm curious what it does to your aromatization rates. And if you find yourself like needing more AI at times when you're smoking a lot of pot, I'm curious.
Yeah. Leave some comments. That could be a cool discussion to get going.
Sorry, I have nothing to add to that one.
No, not taking gobby tests.
No. We want to have kids.
All right. You want to introduce that range of motion?
Yeah. So there are a couple of other topics that we're going to talk about this week, just with relation to Dave's training. And I'm really lucky that Dave values my opinion. So when he's hitting a wall in training with something, usually he'll ask me like, "Hey, what do you think?" kind of thing. And someone commented on one of his videos this week. Was it this week or last week?
It was within last week.
Recent.
It was like an incline Smith press video, I think.
But someone commented kind of saying, "Hey, it looks like he needs some more team full ROM in his life." And don't get me wrong, like I'm all for full range of motion, right? But I think more than anything, people need to stop and ask themselves where the motion is actually coming from. Mm-hmm. If you go and you actually watch Dave's videos, for him to take the movement any deeper, that's what she said, he wouldn't actually be elongating the muscle. He'd be dumping his shoulder forward and shearing actually the joint forward and actually losing tension on the pecs and losing tension on the anterior delts by virtue of a change in joint position. So in addition to that, he's taking tension off the muscles and he's putting the joint in a compromised position. So I think, it's always worth videoing your movements. And that's one reason that we knew to look at that with Dave. But using more range of motion, if it's beyond your body's functional capacity, isn't necessarily going to give you any other benefit. And if anything, can be detrimental.
Yeah. Are you just doing it arbitrarily to do it, or are you doing it for? It's funny you say that though, because if you remember, Steve Kuklo always was like the knock early in his career was he had no chest, no upper chest. He was all shoulders, and the way he actually brought up his chest was that exact thing, shortening the range of motion on his incline pressing.
Yeah.
For that exact reason. Yeah.
So did he shorten it on the way down? Like didn't go
as deep. Yeah. Yeah. And I don't remember who told him, but he was, he's training at Destination when someone there was explaining to him, and the way he explained it to me was, probably the telephone game. So who knows what it was, but it was basically that he just thought like when he went past about whatever point, just his chest wasn't really doing anything anymore. It was all just putting strain on his shoulders. His shoulders were taking over. So what's the point of doing it? And I think another example, I get flack all the time for my used to for my close grip bench. And I think if you read a textbook or like an old Weider magazine, the way you're supposed to do close grip bench is close grip, elbows tight to your side, bring the bar down like this, and press like that. But to me, what I feel like when I'm doing that is I feel like I'm going like this basically, which is just like a front raise,
Right.
That's like my elbows not moving much at all. What I do is I try to keep my elbows up high. Mm-hmm. So my motion is this: if I from here to get the bar farther down to my chest, my joint doesn't move anymore. It's all the way in. Now to get the bar down lower, all I do is move the shoulder joint. I'm not, my triceps aren't elongating anymore at that point.
Well, they are to a degree, just based on where they attach on the scap, but not to a degree that's actually meaningful. I think what a lot of people forget to actually think about is the more you lift, the longer you lift, and the more you put on size, and the more your body changes. One of the first things that happens is we lose posterior capsule mobility on our ball and socket joints, on our hips, and on our shoulders. And if you're losing that posterior capsule mobility, you're not going to have the arthrokinematics to use full range of motion without basically creating a lot of stress on the front, which is pretty much exactly what Kukla was feeling. And so I would almost argue that the more size you have, unless you're someone like, don't get me wrong, again, like I love Dr. Mike and Jared. I think they're great people. They're great educators. And I think they would probably also say that if the range of motion isn't actually coming from the muscle and it's undue stress on the joint, that's probably not the way to go. But I think a lot of people forget to actually look at where the movement's coming from. They think about the movement like a close grip Smith, instead of actually looking at the joints and the muscles that are contracting and the axes around those muscles and where they're contracting.
Yeah. I think it's important too to like not pigeonhole yourself into thinking you're X kind of lifter or Y kind of lifter. Because I think if you do watch, say, your favorite pro, they often fall into a similar pattern or similar way of doing their reps across the board. And they may or may not have their reasons for doing so, but it's like you look at someone, maybe they have like kind of their short stroking most of the pressing movements, and they're, say, not leg pressing that deep, and they're kind of using a similar rep style when they train every body part. But like, I don't like to treat people like they're special snowflakes, because a lot of things just aren't that variable. But I think like arthrokinematics and anthropometrics are one of the things that are really variable. Like we have quite a bit of variability in the way our skeletons are put together, and the way, I think to some degree, even the way the muscles insert and where exactly they insert and attach.
Quite a
And
bit.
so just using myself as an example, like especially as I've gotten bigger, I have had to shorten my range of motion on pressing movements in particular. But then if you look at the way that I leg press or hack squat, I can get really deep in most movements and still be mechanically sound. And that's probably partly because I'm decently flexible for my size, but I also have really wide hips, a wide hip angle where my femurs are, and really long legs. So you would almost expect a longer range of motion there relative to the joints compared to what I can do at my shoulders for a chest press, because unfortunately, I have wide hips and narrow shoulders. So.
Well, you bring up a really good point too, looking at upper and lower differences. One thing we talked about the other day was Dave mentioned having long legs and how that's going to correlate to different need and range of motion. And I kind of said, well, hang on, you have to look at the orientation of the structure of the actual hip bone, because the way that your sockets point is going to determine basically the angle at which you can press and subsequently the depth that you'll get. Whereas for upper body stuff, very often the bigger you get, the more back training you do, the more locked up your rib cage gets, you're going to have way less shoulder blade mobility, and I don't want to say like stability because that's not quite what I mean, but congruency between the scap and rib cage, which is going to have a pretty serious effect on ball and socket range of motion. So for someone like Dave's size, the more size he puts on his upper body, especially in his back, it's probably going to be harder to get more and more shoulder range of motion, unless he's also coupling that with opening of the pec and anterior delt. Actually, that's a good, if I had to pick like one area that I think people need to, as they're putting on size, maintain mobility, I would say it's the rib cage, not the thoracic spine. Yes, T-spine, but it doesn't really move all that much. The ribs, however, have to be plastic and they have to be pliable. And as guys put on size, I've got a bunch of people on my roster right now who, like, the big thing that I'm working on, the big thing I'm working on them with, that's English, is actually regaining rib cage flexibility. Because if that can't move, it's really going to affect how locked up everything else in that area tends to get, anteriorly and posteriorly.
I was going to ask, you kind of already started talking about it, but as somebody loses a little bit of mobility as they get bigger and stronger, how important is it to try to basically mitigate that and keep all of their range of motion versus how much can you kind of say, okay, well, I've lost like a half inch, an inch here or there, but it's really going to be okay as long as I stay within the active range for a muscle.
I think it's phasic.
Yeah.
I think it's phasic throughout the year. Yeah.
What do you mean by that? Like you need times where you're pushing load and not worrying about it, and other times where you're trying to get some of that range back?
If you're going to think about the pendulum of movement, there are going to be times where the total arc of motion is slightly less, and there are going to be times where the total arc of motion may be standardized but shifted one way or another in terms of total range relative to standard, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's actually, I feel like that applies to your training quite a bit, especially because your kind of unique injury history. Because like you'll hear people a lot, especially people who are into progressive overload, which we love, talk about how much you need to standardize your reps session to session, week to week, and over the course of months. And that's great insofar as you can actually do it safely, but your range is kind of fluid. And you mentioned being phasic over the year, but I feel like sometimes it's like phasic week to week.
Yeah, people don't understand how malleable and how plastic our nervous systems are, even acutely, with regards to range of motion, output, things like that. And all the input that our brain gets about our joint position, which is highly dictated by, again, I hate the freaking P word, but our posture. I'll just use myself as an example. If I keep conventional pulling, if I keep that in for too long, it throws my center of mass so far forward, my pelvis travels with it. And it makes it really hard for me to continue to leg press deep without my deep pelvis muscles being chronically hypertonic, trying to compensate for an adductor tendon that's not attached. So I have to phase that in throughout the year. But I think for bigger guys especially, obviously you want to be able to maintain at least an acceptable range of motion, because if you're tight in training, you're going to be tight in posing. And the fluidness of your transitions, I think when you have a greater arc of motion, is going to allow you to hit that endpoint with a really, really visible kind of, meaningful pop.
Yeah. I was already too tight to hit poses optimally, but now I've never really had to deal with shoulder issues that much. And now my left shoulder is finally bothering me a little bit. And I notice just for check-ins, when I go to do a front double or a back double, getting both arms up into this position, it's so much harder on the left. And then my right trap on the other side really wants to shrug or elevate all the time. And it's really hard to let that come out, and so I can get my right lat out all the way.
It's so funny. When I talk to dudes who compete, the two poses I always talk about with me are their front double and their rear lat spread with regards to shoulder pain and shoulder mobility.
Yeah.
Because a lot of them tend to find that they either can or cannot externally rotate one or both arms appropriately, or they can't actually get a lat into position because their posterior calves on their shoulders are so restricted they can't actually allow things to move the way they need to.
That really surprised me when I tried to come back after years out of the sport. My rear lat was always like a really good pose for me. I remember at my peak, I felt like I could just almost just like flop them out, you know, like
you could probably feel it before you started.
Oh yeah, I mean, and it was like, yeah, it was almost like I could decide how far I wanted to let my lat spread out, you know. And then I remember coming back, and I couldn't. I could, you know, and I knew I was carrying about the same size. My body weight was roughly the same. You know, my strength was similar. All my body composition was roughly, you know, close enough where it should have still been a good pose for me. And I just could not, you know, and it wasn't like the wing scapular thing that people do, but it was like I just couldn't get my joint in the right position to really let my lats drop out. And it was incredibly frustrating.
And if that was after a transition into more office work, that completely makes sense.
Oh, it definitely was. Yeah. Speaking of, that's just made me remember something. You can, I used to look, and a lot of times I could guess who used to play baseball by their front double by.
Oh, totally. Or if they were especially.
Their right arm, if they're right-handed, their right arm would always be back farther than the, and I noticed that on myself one time, I don't know, just, you know, at some point in my life, like playing with my kids on the ground, if I put my arms like this, I mean, now I'm all messed up, but my right arm, I could go all the way to the ground, no problem. And my left, I couldn't. And so I ended up finding some cool, there were some articles on about that, like when they were studying the Tommy John surgery and stuff.
That's actually so much more related to the fact that we are inherently asymmetrically biased as people. There's a reason that a lot of people can externally rotate their right side almost too much, and that's why their front double looks super weird. Like if I hit it wrong, it looks like I have like a weird chicken wing because I'm trying so hard to crank back because that's the region I have available. But that's very much related to the fact that we as people are not symmetrical. Actually, there's I saved it on Instagram. It's a really cool video showing just how much the diaphragm and the liver and the heart all change as we breathe and how different the right and the left sides are. It was wild. But you think about how much that influences everything. So when you breathe in, again, like visualize on Dave here, this whole thing gets pulled down. That's going to create traction in that whole area. And we're biased towards the state of inhalation and exhalation differently on left and right sides, just because of organs and we're people.
Yeah.
I'm glad you like hammer that into my head for a couple of years, because I used to really over worry about one side feeling even with the other. And I don't mean like worrying about strength or even size side to side. I mean, if I did an exercise and I looked down and what felt like a good foot position was like the right toe 1 inch, you know, further forward,
a half an inch,
I'd be like, oh my God, I'm wrong. And if I keep going this way, I'm going to like tear something in my hip. It's like, no, I don't think I've ever gotten hurt just going with the stance or the grip that felt appropriate, because it being just a little bit off on one side is normal. It's not.
It's so.
I think when we first met, the whole first year of us being together was me being like, it's okay.
Yeah, you're fine.
That's hilarious. That's hilarious, because I had the exact same thing when I first started out. I was so hyper concerned about doing everything perfectly, being symmetrical, that I was like overly worried about the proper amount of warming up. But I remember my natural foot position is always like left foot about maybe 1 inch farther in front of my right, and it used to like really stress me out. But and I would force myself to put them even, but of course, you know, it didn't work. That felt uncomfortable, and I would like
your left low back probably took it.
Yeah, so it's funny you say that, because it would like really stress me out, because you don't know anything, and I thought I want everything to be perfect. You know, if I'm doing, you know, like if I'm crooked this way, then some muscles are getting worked more, and I'm going to be, as I get bigger, it's going to get even worse, and then I'm going to have one big leg, one big quad, one big hamstring or whatever, and.
It's so wild, because as bodybuilders too, there's a difference between training and posing, because our presentation, we want to create either the look of symmetry or look of flow or balance, left, right, upper, lower, all of that. And if you look at most people are going to have over or under development somewhere throughout their body, and you'll tend to kind of see it happen some little bit of a spiral. And so I think it's really interesting looking at posing, and I'm a terrible poser, but I love looking at other people. You can really kind of manipulate how much that asymmetry comes out just by playing with position a little bit. And you can really tell the people who put time into posing and really taking the time to know their body, because you see just a little change in, maybe the direction hips are facing slightly.
I have a perfect example of that. A 4-time Mr. Olympia, Jay Cutler, his right leg is quite a bit smaller than his left. And so when people hit a front double bicep, most people don't just stand flat footed. They put their weight kind of on one foot, and then one foot they flare out a little bit. And that foot that they flare out usually gets pushed a little bit forward, an inch or two farther forward. Jay did the opposite. So if you look, and once you see it, it's like you can't unsee it. But his left leg is like the flared out leg, but rather than like how everyone else does it, he's pulling it behind him. And then so then it makes it from the front, it looks like his legs are much more closer in size than they really were. And I always thought that was like really clever, because it's one of those things like once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because then as soon as you see his front double bi that way, you'll be like, it almost looks like a negative photo, like something doesn't feel right. It's like an optical illusion, because that leg that your brain almost just assumes it's in front when he push it behind.
I want to go find that now. I'm gonna geek out over this.
Yeah.
That's
hopefully I didn't make that up, but
one other thing that we're going to talk about. Do you want to transition?
Yeah.
So one other thing we're going to talk about with Dave's training, just we thought it was a good learning point for people. If you look at Dave's training, especially with his incline pressing, you'll notice with any pressing movement, he's more limited by his tricep strength on the top end than he is at the bottom. And so if he's using movement for chest, but he's more limited by top end movement, he's artificially limiting his chest training by being held back basically by triceps. So, in powerlifting, you very often look at kind of a builder exercise to bring up your weak point, so to speak. And what I do with a lot of my clients is if they're limited in a certain, and their main like push overload movement, I'm going to find their secondary movement should be a complement to that to bring up their weak point. Not necessarily from a static standpoint, but because it'll permit continued perpetuation through the first kind of major movement. Mm-hmm. So for Dave, one of the things we did was look at changing his regular Smith press to, I didn't necessarily suggest a close grip incline. I just said, hey, have you thought about doing something heavy for your triceps so that you're not artificially limiting your chest growth by being limited at your top end lockout strength?
Yeah.
I probably would have gone to something like a heavy barbell skull crusher, or maybe even a heavy dip if you can dip. JM would be a band of JM press would be great on a Smith.
Oh, well, it's funny because I was doing like a JM press on a chest press machine. And actually, just purely for size, this is one of my favorite tricep exercises. Get on one of those like selectorized upright bench machines. Set the seat as low as it'll go, so not the bar, but the handles are basically in line with like your sternum or your neck. And then as you descend, or as you on the negative, like kind of tuck your elbows a little bit. So you basically come into a
kind of getting that flare out like you were doing too, Justin.
And I mean, you can do this with any implement. Like Smith machine works great. Barbell obviously works fine, but I've just found that with the machine, you get like a little bit of an arc that the moment of which is around your feet, and that makes it feel a little bit better to me, at least. Because I think if you, it's like the opposite of letting the bar drift over your face in a bench press. Mm-hmm. Like you're basically arcing straight or like down towards your feet just a tiny bit, and I think that's going to promote a little bit more triceps recruitment. Would you say?
Probably. I mean, I think it depends on how you're aligning your elbows too, like where the actual joint axis is.
But I wish, as a general rule, people, especially when they're really kind of learning their body and learning weightlifting, if there was more emphasis by the industry as a whole, rather than calling it like, a chest press, like realize like you're trying to work this muscle. So play with it.
Yeah.
Learn where your body, learn where this machine or this movement or whatever actually stresses the area you're trying to stress. And I think you can come up with some pretty interesting things. And I think if you really watch, I'll go back to Jay Cutler. If you watch, he'll do, I mean, a lot of his exercises were really kind of pretty unique to him. It's like if the range of motion, where things were positioned, and you can almost see him like kind of thinking back into his head, like where he's really trying to feel what the muscle's actually doing.
Well, it's like the Meadows row, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because he wanted to hit that portion of his back, and so I think
perfect.
So married to the name of an exercise. I think what you're saying is they get married to the name of an exercise and how they're shown to do something, rather than saying, okay, I'm trying to hit my lower lat. How am I going to do that? And like trying to contract the muscle and almost just seeing where the arc goes at that point.
Mm-hmm. Or as a coach, you'll always get, I don't feel this movement. What should I do? a different movement.
Change it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I get a lot of questions from my clients just about, they'll see, an influencer doing something a certain way. And they say, well, so-and-so said that I'm doing lateral raises, it's supposed to be done this way. And I'm like, okay, well, that's true. Yes. But let's look at the mechanics of why. And they're saying that you should do a lateral raise this way to help align that portion of the muscle with the actual anti-gravity pull. What position is their joint in? What position is your joint in? And so I think when you actually teach people to how to start thinking about the muscles rather than like you always say, the muscles inside the movement,
Right.
It becomes a lot easier to figure out what you need to do differently.
Well, you mentioned Meadows before. Like he would even say pretty often that the movement almost doesn't matter. And what he meant by that was that like we have this way of kind of putting exercises in these little boxes. And there's like, you might say, okay, there's like 100 or 200 or whatever exercises that exist. In reality, there's like infinite exercise. What matters is the way you execute. So it's like you learn the principle of like working this muscle means the joints are roughly in this position relative to each other. And, the resistance profile is such that this muscle or that muscle is actually taking the brunt of the force or producing the brunt of the tension. And you can apply that to anything. And then at that point, it just kind of becomes preference, or, you use other reasons to dictate which exact exercises you choose, maybe strength curve or what hurts versus what doesn't, just for example.
I think it's cool. You see a lot of people really start to progress when they just start to figure out how they're going to feel their muscle work the most too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if you want to, how am I going to word this? Like the infinite number of exercises, try drawing a free body diagram for any exercise, like you would a physics problem, with like the length of the bone, where, the torque, R cross F, the force and the radius, how that joint's positioned, how the tendons are positioned, how, like even do a calf raise and move how far the protuberance of your heel is from the center line of the tibia. Move that by a millimeter and see how much difference that changes all the forces just on, it's like it literally is infinite. I mean, anyone took a physics class, it's difficult to draw a free body diagram of two balls moving. We got 600 muscles all working together, and however many joints.
Well, and so many of them change their roles as you go through a certain movement too. So like in a squat, a lot of people think about, putting a band around their knees to drive more glute activation. And it's maybe not necessarily driving more glute activation, but what it's playing into is the fact that some deep hip rotators change their role from internal to external rotators. And to get that last bit of motion to get below parallel, you actually need external rotation. So by putting the band there, you're encouraging the external rotation, encouraging those muscles to make that transition, to pull your hips down, allow your ischials to drop. But we only think about it from what we see on the outside, very, very simply. So
I think this is one of the things that's kind of lost on people who completely focus on progressive overload too. I mean, you get caught in like, I need this movement to increase. Like, well, yes, like at a 30,000 foot view, that's going to get you bigger. But even someone like Dante Trudel, who's like, at this point, the godfather of progressive overload in bodybuilding, would say, okay, if you've got, he would say one set of stuff to the beginner crew who just needed to put on a lot of mass. But then when it came to advanced guys or people who just could not get a muscle to grow, he'd be like, you have to get funky with it, with the technology. And so the same guy who was preaching like just deadlift, squat as much as you can to get big, was also having guys do these like really weird looking exercises for the specific purpose of like growing a specific tissue that they couldn't activate almost any other way, and then try to get stronger that way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it also comes back to kind of what we were talking about before, with as you get bigger, your leverages are going to change based on how much your body changes in the tissue that you put on.
Yeah.
Your center of mass as a whole in general for most people is going to be shoved forward the bigger you get, which means that the more forward oriented you become, it's going to be more and more important that you have something in your program every day that allows you to start to reference behind you. Because the more between front back on one side you become kind of tethered to, the harder it is to actually get everything working together.
Indeed. Well, do you have anything else?
Was that all our topics?
That's all topics for
Wow, we actually got through them all tonight.
Yeah. Good talk. Good talk, Russ.
All right, guys. Well, thanks again for tuning in. What do we say? Like, comment, share, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications.
Visit teamtroponin.com. New content, big content drop, lots of cool stuff. We're getting some guest writers coming in.
And let us know if there's something you want us to touch on.
Yep.
Yes.
Also visit First Attachment Nutrition. I think right now there's a BOGO 25% on Go Pills. If
Yep.
you want to be not fat for the spring, you got to start now.
Yes.
Also, they've got some sweet swag out.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, mine's dirty, but I got the new steak rice repeat shirt that I wore.
I
while
love
going
that
today.
shirt.
Yeah.
I want to get it. Drop it.
When did you get? Did you? How long ago did you get the? We got new material. The new material is awesome.
Really?
I must have gotten the new shipment because it took a little longer than everything else in the shipment.
Is it just the tri-blend or is it a different?
It's a tri-blend. We were using. I wanted to get. There's people that can listen to this. The Next Level is one of the main companies that produces mass shirts. They have like a 6410 suede crew that I really like, but we couldn't get it in the quantities we needed. So we had to go with like a 3600, which was a dual blend, and it was nice and it fit well. The sleeves were kind of tighter, so it made you look bigger, but it was a little stiffer than I wanted. So we found another company that does a true tri-blend, and like you get like, you ever see when people used to wear those old army shirts? I always used to see army and they'd be all old. You can almost see through them. They'd be so worn. They look so comfortable. That's what the new material is.
Nice.
So I'm going to get some made for Team Troponin too and send to you. I love the material.
It is different from yours, yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. Oh, so that one's tight. I thought I just grew. I was like, oh, I didn't even get off season. Dang, it's just crushing my dreams.
All right. Well, thanks again, guys. We'll see you next week.
For more content like this, visit www.teamtroponin.com.
This video is brought to you by First Attachment Nutrition. Battle-tested nutrition, expert formulated supplements. Join the First Attachment revolution.